This episode was brought to you by Resilient Nutrition. Pals, greetings and welcome to another episode of Everything Endurance. It is, once again, a delight to have you with us today. I'm going to get straight down to business. If you are one of the people that has already perused the Beyond the Ultimate store and grabbed one of our brilliant looking new range of BTU and Fractal hats for running, they're only a couple of weeks away now, so we're really excited about them. Can't wait to get my hands on them. I mean, they look great for what we've seen so far, and soon we'll have them in your hands too. If you haven't already got one, then head over to the store and have a look for that now, store.beyondtheultimate.co.uk. You'll also find our new range of Legionnaire style hats in there as well. So if you've got a hot race coming up later in the year and you don't want to burn the back of your neck, or you're low on hair like I am, then yeah, they're absolutely perfect. So head over to the store and have a look for those. Thanks to our friends in Fractal for sending those over for us. Our guest today, you know what? I know I usually do a build-up where I give you little tidbits, little factlets from their CV while we build up to saying who it is. But this is Greg Potter's third appearance in 6 weeks. There's a set of 3 podcasts that we've had planned for a while. And I think you're really, really going to enjoy today's. But before we get down to that, Greg Potter obviously joins us from Resilient Nutrition, the company he co-founded, and we've got a lot of their products in our store at the moment as well. Now, we only stock stuff in there that we like. Problem with this one is I like it a little bit too much, and it's not allowed to be stored anywhere near me anymore. But the elite long-range fuels that we've got from Resilient Nutrition have been in the store for a few weeks now. Off the back of the podcast, quite a few people have been buying them. A lot of people have been buying them. Chris has been to the post office a lot of times. And we're getting really good feedback on them, which is totally understandable because they are, as I said, they are delicious. They come in a number of different flavors, so there's cinnamon versions and chocolate versions, and just have a look at the full range. You're bound to find something you like in there. There's a coconut one as well, but on top of that, they're also really useful for a number of reasons. So they come in a pouch that's got a good 4 or 5 portions in there compared to little gels that you might take out with you running normally. So that's going to be less packaging because you haven't got 5 gels worth of packaging knocking around on you anyway, and you're definitely not going to get sticky fingers like you usually do from them. But it also works out better cost wise. For every 5 gels you're getting through one of these pouches that they do. Screw the top off, squeeze it in your mouth, screw it back on again. Absolutely fantastic. So less packaging, less cost, makes more sense. But also they have micronutrients and supplements in them that have been specially chosen for specific purposes. So the range is also split up into energizing products, calming products, and energizing and rebuilding products. So for fueling during a race, say, for recovery afterwards, for calming yourself down when you're recovering afterwards. These are, they're just great products. I think you're really going to enjoy them. So store.beyondtheultimate.co.uk. Head over there and have a look at those now before I snaffle literally all of them and Chris has to shoot me. Okay? So you'd be doing me a favor, frankly. And now we are going to move into today's podcast. Greg Potter, part 3. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this. This is quite specific. We've done this podcast from the point of view of somebody that has a big endurance style event coming up, and they're maybe 2 to 4 weeks out from it, and planning their nutrition and what they're going to eat and how they're going to eat and when they're going to eat, right the way up to the couple of days before the race. We're going to talk about carb loading and what you should be doing to your body a couple of days before this big event just to prepare yourself for it. We're then going to look at fueling during the event itself. We're going to look at fueling for events in different extreme environments. I just think anybody with an interest in outdoor adventuring, hiking, or endurance sports is going to get a lot out of this podcast. So buckle up, headphones in, and enjoy. We're going to talk once again to Greg Potter. All right then, Greg Potter, once again, 3rd time on the bounce. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you, Will?
Yeah, I'm not too bad at all. Thank you very much. I'm having a delightful day looking out over the city over here. How have you been, Greg?
I'm well. Yeah, we've moved flat again for the 12th time in 12 months, but such is COVID life.
Oh, man. Yeah, for the benefit of anyone who is catching up with these podcasts on YouTube, it's got to be getting confusing by now that Greg is never in the same place. I could try and lie to you and just say he's been changing his Zoom backdrop, but the guy gets around.
Someone said that to me today. They said, is that a fake Zoom backdrop? But it is, in fact, real, I promise.
Well, also, no offense, it's not that this flat doesn't look nice, but if you were putting in, like, you can choose any Zoom backdrop you'd like, just normal living room scene probably wouldn't be the one you go for, is it? I tend to go for, like, a cantina scene from Star Wars or something behind me if I'm going to be flashy.
Oh, I thought you were going to say something BT related.
You'd think so, wouldn't you, on the podcast? And there's an argument here that if any of my colleagues are listening to this, they'd probably have expected me to say that as well, but here we are. Yeah.
Under the bus at the start.
Yeah, well, that is traditional now. That's 2 podcasts in a row. So thanks very much for that, Greg. We will definitely not be having you back on. I gotta tell you, Greg, I look forward to these ones. After the first one we did on sleep and the other one on nutrition, in my intro for the last podcast that I did, I actually mentioned that it's extremely rare for me to go back and listen to my podcasts again. And that's not to the detriment of my guests. That's very much that I am sick of the sound of my own voice by the time I've finished editing most of these. But I have gone back and gone through the sleep and the nutrition ones again because there's just tons to be taken out of them. So I'm looking forward to this. I've got my notepad out and everything so I can make notes while we're going along.
That's good to hear. And I know that feeling too. When I re-listen to myself, it's practically self-harm. So unlike you, I haven't re-listened to them. And I apologize for that in advance.
Yeah, I mean, I tell people, yeah, I think I have an okay voice. And then I hear it back myself. I'm like, who's this guy? I've never met him before. Do not want to pint with him. Steer clear. Like, yeah, not great. But we're going to go back into nutrition a bit today, aren't we? But we're going to be looking a bit more specifically towards, well, race day nutrition, but that last couple of weeks as you're funneling into your big event, whatever it may be. I know quite a lot of our listeners are sort of coming at this from an ultra running angle. But whether it's an ultra run or a huge hike out in the hills or some multi-day adventure that we've put together, we're going to talk a little bit about race day nutrition today. I say we, Greg. The pressure's on you here for the science facts. I'm afraid the burden has fallen to you to actually know things. Where do we want to start?
We could start shortly before the race itself.
Yeah, let's go sort of a couple of weeks away from the race. Maybe your training's been going well. The big red sticker on the calendar is coming up. It's a couple of weeks away from you, and we're thinking about our nutrition over the next couple of weeks. Where are we now? How should we be best preparing ourselves?
So there are a few things to consider, and one of them, which will come up repeatedly in our conversation today, I'm sure, is the digestive system. And
we're not going to get through today without using the words digestive. What was it? Danger pants.
Well, you've just used them.
Yeah. I thought I'd get it out the way early.
So unfortunately, danger pants are very common among ultra athletes. And if you look at the prevalence of severe gastrointestinal problems among ultra runners, of 3 or so papers that have been published to date, prevalence is varied between 73 and 96%.
Wow.
So there's a very, very high probability that you're going to experience some digestive issues. And of the different ones that have been looked at, the most common are nausea and regurgitation, or the urge to regurgitate. And I mention those symptoms because that might influence how you prepare for the event. And there are different aspects to this. So one is training your gut for your race in advance. And the minimum amount of time that you would want to train your gut ahead of the event is probably 2 weeks, based on studies done by people such as Ricardo Costa. And when you go through a gut training program, there are various different changes that take place in your digestive system. So one is that you teach your stomach to empty faster. Another is that there might be some changes in these intestinal transporters that shift glucose and fructose, which are sugars, from the intestine into the blood. And there might be some changes in things like certain enzymes that are involved in breaking down food as well. And of the different gut training protocols that have been published to date, the brief, most effective one is probably training the gut 3 times a week for 2 weeks. And the idea is that during that gut training protocol, you're going to progressively increase the amount of food, calories and carbohydrates specifically, that you're taking on board per unit of time. And your goal should be to reach a level at the end of the gut training protocol, which is probably 20% or so higher than what you will actually take on board during the race itself. So you're trying to force those adaptations that will make the race nutrition more tolerable. And over the course of that protocol, you'll typically start with something that you find tolerable. So if you use the example of carbohydrate, then you might start with something which is either fluid or a gel. And there is going to be progression in the amount of carbohydrate you're taking on board per hour. So maybe, for instance, you begin with 30 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And by the end, you're aiming to take on board 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And while we're on that subject, during the event itself, it makes sense to take in multiple types of carbohydrate at once because they use different transporter mechanisms. So there's a sodium-dependent glucose transporter, SGLT1, in the gut, which is how you transport glucose from inside the gut into the bloodstream. And there's also GLUT5 transporter, which is involved in transporting fructose from the gut into the bloodstream. And so if you ingest both glucose and fructose at the same time, and when I say glucose, that could be pure glucose, or it could be something like maltodextrin, then you can take carbohydrate in and digest it at a higher rate than if you were using just one of those alone. And you probably want a roughly 2-to-1 ratio between glucose and fructose. So if you were aiming to consume 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour, that would be 60 grams of glucose and 30 grams of fructose. And you'd probably divide that by 3 doses. So you'd have 30 grams of carbohydrate every 20 minutes, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you'd go through that type of program. And in that example, you might begin with 30 grams of carbohydrate per hour and move up to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. But there can be another progression in parallel to that, in which you begin with something which is liquid or gel-like, and then you transition to consuming solids by the end of it, because solids require greater digestion than something which is liquid, because you have to mechanically break them down. So gut training is really important, and it's critical that you use the items that you're going to be consuming during the race itself, during that phase. And if you're an ultra runner, especially if you're doing a multi-stage ultra, there's a good chance that you won't just be consuming gels for the whole event, and I wouldn't recommend that. And with that in mind, you should base your training program, your gut training program, on the items that you intend to consume. And so it would make sense to speak to the race organizers if there are aid stations, so you can find out some of the items that will be there, so you can include those in your nutrition if you plan to include those items. And 2 weeks is the minimum. And if you can't or don't want to do that type of gut training 3 times a week, you could include just 1 gut training session a week as a minimum, but you'd probably want to train your gut for longer. So in that instance, you might do 10 weeks of once a week gut training. And the most important session for that type of training is the training session that most closely mimics the race itself in terms of duration, intensity, terrain, environmental conditions, and so on. And I would hope that at that stage in your preparation, you're going through a taper, but there should still be some type of relatively specific ultra running, albeit in lower volumes than earlier in the training program.
So to sort of put it in the context of someone who might be training for the kind of big ultra run that BTU does, they'll likely be doing some really long time on feet sessions, right up until the last couple of weeks before they head out there. So we'd be talking about using that kind of long, steady once a week session to do some of this gut training with as well. So sort of mimic their race day nutrition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's important for several reasons. One is just that if you look at how gut function changes over the course of exercise, that depends on the duration and the intensity of the exercise. And unfortunately, running seems to lead to more gastrointestinal disturbances than other types of exercise, such as cycling, which is because of the mechanical oscillation of the gut while you're bouncing around, unsurprisingly. So with that said, you need that gut training session, and there are various modifying factors, one of which would be if you have some sort of gastrointestinal disorder. So if you have IBS, then that will change things, and it's important to see a good practitioner to address that first and come up with a plan in concert with that practitioner. Now, with that said, there are certain dietary constituents that quite commonly lead to problems for some people. And it would make sense to go through what some of those are now. So as one example of this, there are these short chain fermentable carbohydrates, which are known as Fodmaps, that you might have heard of.
Yes.
And that stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. But these different types of carbohydrates, which often end up being metabolized by microorganisms in the gut, and that results in the formation of gas. And if you've got lots of gas forming in parts of your gut during exercise, then that's not going to be a good thing in terms of your digestive comfort. But also, if some of those constituents enter, say, the colon, then that's going to draw water into that area too, which is going to further exacerbate those problems. So if you have something like IBS, or if you're struggling with your digestive system in general, especially during exercise, then you could try a low Fodmap diet. And Monash University in Australia has a Fodmap app that's worth checking out. And just to give you some ideas about what high Fodmap items are, in the case of fruits, they include things like plums, apples, pears, mangoes. Vegetables include things like onions, garlic leeks. There are beans and pulses. Then there are a variety of other things, including some grains, so wheat and rye and barley. And if you can do away with the highest FODMAP items, then you might find that quite dramatically reduces your gastrointestinal disturbances during racing. And Ricardo Costas published some nice work looking at interventions of different duration. One of them was a case study of an ultra runner, and that person underwent 6 days of a low FODMAP diet before a 6-day long multi-stage ultra, and the person had quite large improvements in their symptoms during the ultra.
And there are tools out there to do that kind of thing quite easily. And we've just rarely, for one of these podcasts, Greg, we've just played into an area that I actually know a little bit about. Me and my girlfriend live on a sort of low FODMAP diet as a consequence of some digestive problems she has. And there's like the Monash University that you mentioned there, there's like an app available that can help guide you through some of the foods that you can and can't have, and substitutions that you can make quite easily. And we live with that kind of diet on a day-to-day basis without any stress.
Yeah.
You know?
And it's not that restrictive, as you know.
No.
So if you look at the category of vegetables or fruits, there are still loads of items that you can consume. But something to add is that I wouldn't recommend that somebody sticks to this type of diet unless it is necessary. So in the case of YouTube, well, it is necessary. But the issue is that diet diversity is really important, particularly to the microorganisms in the gut, because different organisms will feast on different dietary constituents. And for your health, you want to have a gut that is very diverse. And that means that you should aim to consume a wide variety of different kind of plants each week. And there's been work categorizing people by different quantities of plants consumed per week. And unsurprisingly, people who consume 30 plants or more each week, there's different types of plants, that is, have much more diverse microbiotas than people with less diverse diets. And so if you have digestive issues during exercise, but that's just during something like a multi-stage ultra, then maybe you save the low Fodmap diet for the days before the event, but then the rest of the time you consume a diet which is as diverse as possible. And that brings up something related, which we'll get to later. But if you have a more diverse gut, then if some of the microorganisms in the gut end up moving from the gut into the bloodstream, then there are certain species that will produce less harmful consequences if they transfer into the gut than other species. And if you have a diet which is low in fiber, rich in certain types of fat, rich in processed meats, then you're more likely to have some pathogenic microorganisms in the gut, such as E. coli. And if those then enter the bloodstream, then you're more likely to experience some pretty nasty effects and things like nausea and so on. But we can come back to that. So a low FODMAP approach can be helpful. And there are less restrictive versions of that too. One would just be cutting out lactose and fructose, for example, or cutting down on those. Lactose is commonly a problem, as pretty much everyone I'm sure knows. Lactose is sugar that's found in milk. And while we're all born with the enzyme lactase, which is involved in breaking down lactose into its constituents, not everyone continues to produce lactase later in life. And if you don't, then consuming lactose is going to cause you some discomfort. So just cutting down on sugar-rich dairy, so milk, yogurt, that type of thing. Something like butter would be less likely to cause issues, can be helpful. And then cutting down on fructose, so that might mean not adding table sugar to things, but also reducing your intake of things like apples and pears and so on. Those can all be helpful strategies. And then one other approach, which is handy for many people, is consuming a lower fiber diet. Again, this isn't something I'd recommend in the long term for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but if you were doing a single stage ultra, I'd have no reservation in somebody consuming a very low fiber diet for that day. Again, if you consume the low fiber diet, then you're going to give those microorganisms fewer of those fermentable substrates and thereby offset the likelihood of you experiencing some of those issues. So with that said, that brings us to the couple of days before the event.
Yeah.
And people, of course, have long spoken about pasta parties, that type of thing.
Mate, I ran my first marathon 5 years ago, and it was all anyone seemed to have to say to me on the run up to it, like, oh, wait, and I did. I did my first ever marathon in Berlin. I went to an Italian restaurant the night before because I just couldn't shake this idea that I was supposed to fill up on pasta. I didn't know why I was doing it. Just everyone told me to.
And there are good reasons to think that carbohydrate or glycogen loading specifically might be helpful. Although interestingly, if you look at the actual research that's had people carbohydrate load, it hasn't always shown performance improvements, but there's no real downside to using that approach. And the way that you would go about that is to consume up to about 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per 24 hours for the 24 to 48 hours before the event. So for 1 to 2 days before the event. And during that time, to avoid consuming huge amounts of food, but also to take up the carbohydrates more rapidly, you want to keep fat low. And you want to probably maintain your protein intake as it is. And as an aside, I think most ultra runners would do well by fixing their protein intake each day to something like 1.6 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. So during those 2 days before the event, you're going to consume your normal amount of protein, minimal fat, 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body weight. And whereas a lot of the time you want to consume low glycemic index carbohydrates, glycemic index is the degree to which your blood sugar swings in response to consuming an item. at this time, you actually want high glycemic index carbohydrates. And Louise Burke did some nice work on this years ago, showing that you can fill your glycogen stores faster if you consume high GI carbs. So the way that those 12 grams of carbohydrates per day are consumed is important, as is the distribution of them. You wouldn't want one meal that contained all of those 12 grams per kilo. Not that that would necessarily be doable, but you're better off spreading that out. And maybe you consume at least 6 meals and or snacks for those 1 to 2 days, each of which contains a similar amount of carbohydrate to the others. And good items to consume at this time would include things like white rice and white potatoes and popcorn. Those are all relatively low fiber, low FODMAP, easy to digest, fast carbohydrates. And you could use some carbohydrate powders and that type of thing too. I don't think they're great from a health perspective, certainly in the long term, but they are an option. And if performance is your only concern, then you should definitely be using that. You struggle with those solid foods or whole foods that I mentioned. So I think that covers a lot of the most important stuff in that build up to the race. I don't know if there's anything you want to pick up on there.
No, I mean, from my layman's perspective, I was sort of glad to hear some justification for the pasta party there, that there is something to be said for loading up your glycogen stores. I wouldn't necessarily recommend the amount of garlic and olive oil that I went through the night before as well, but no, this is all making sense, and this is all stuff that can be quite easily practically applied by people that are nervous and on the run up to an event as well. I sense we're now heading in the direction of getting into the race day itself.
We are.
Is this where we are?
If we're following the clock, then absolutely.
Why not?
So race day itself, a typical recommendation would be to consume anywhere from about 1 gram to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight in the 1 to 4 hours before the event starts. Obviously, that depends on things like race timing. If your event starts later in the day, then you will have consumed more food than that. But if we assume that it starts early in the day at a reasonable time, then that would be a good way to go. And then you're going to, of course, use the strategy that you used in training during the event. And the tricky thing is that energy expenditure, so the number of calories that someone burns during an ultra, can be enormously high. And if you look across the range of energy expenditures, then at the low end, it can be a bit less than 5,000 calories a day. But at the high end, there are reports of people burning over 15,000 calories a day.
Wow.
And energy expenditure tends to be highest in single stage ultras because they're run faster. And very few people will be able to match their calorie intakes to that rate of energy expenditure.
Especially given that in most of these races, you're self-sufficient. So you are only eating over 5 days what you can carry for that 5 days.
Exactly. And the other thing is that if you actually assessed how much carbohydrate, for example, you could burn per hour during this type of event, then it wouldn't necessarily be that high. And so the issue then becomes if you were to assess how much carbohydrate you could consume per hour of the event, then it wouldn't necessarily be that high. So if you try to force feed carbohydrate, then you would end up with a bunch of undigested carbohydrate in the colon, and you'd then have that carbohydrate malabsorption that I mentioned earlier, water going into the large intestine, fermentation of the carbohydrate, all the associated issues that take place. And if you look at recommendations, a lot of people recommend consuming up to about 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour of endurance exercise. And a lot of those people have taken research done on shorter duration endurance activities, so marathon running, for instance, and then just assume that transfers to ultra running. Ultra running, of course, hasn't been as well studied, but looking at some of the data, it doesn't necessarily seem that the findings do transfer. So Ricardo Costa, for example, has published some work showing that among men, they might be able to take on board something like 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per hour. So if you were 80 kilos, that would be 80 grams per hour. And women, it might be closer to 0.8 grams per kilogram. Right. So if that was a 60 kilo woman, then that would only be 48 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And you don't want to exceed that mark, because then you're going to end up with that malabsorption. So I'm not necessarily recommending having some of those expensive tests. I'm just saying that you really need to use your gut training protocol to inform your nutrition strategy, so that you're not over consuming, and it's likely that you will lose some body weight. But as an aside, people who better match their energy intakes to their energy expenditures do seem to perform better, at least in some ultras. So with that out the way, you're going to consume the same items at similar rates to what you were using in your training. Your protein intake should probably be similar to what you were consuming in the weeks leading up to it too. So 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And there are a few different things to consider in addition to that. So one is that people experience taste fatigue during ultras.
Yes. Palate fatigue is something that I'd scribbled down in my notes here.
Yeah. So they often begin ultras and the sweet gels and drinks don't taste too bad, but after a few hours, all of a sudden they're really craving something savory and salty, and cheese seems really appealing. And you should factor that into your preparation. That's why a lot of people end up reaching for things like pretzels later into the race. So bear that in mind when you're deciding on your nutrition strategy. It will change over time, and the palatability of food is really, really important if you're going to carry on eating throughout the event. Then there is, of course, the gut, and I'll just briefly explain why people experience some of these gut problems during running. So
you'd beaten me to that one as well. I'd love some kind of understanding of why it is so prevalent in running, because there are just so many GIFs and memes around this.
So and some pretty good ones too.
Yeah.
So I mentioned earlier that there is the mechanical strain. So there's the actual oscillation of the gut itself. But if we put that to one side, then there are probably two main drivers at play. And these have been compiled into a model, which is this exercise-induced gastrointestinal syndrome that Ricardo Costa came up with. And the two main drivers are as follows. So one is that there is increased activity in the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. That's the so-called fight, flight, freeze, or fornicate branch. And when that happens, your body produces lots of stress hormones. And those are important during exercise because they mobilize energy reserves and therefore increase the availability of certain substrates in the muscles, which help you perform. But the problem with this is that some of those hormones will also negatively affect certain aspects of gastrointestinal function, in particular, the motility of the GI tract. And as an aside, there's been some work looking at changes in GI function according to time of day. So there was a study published not long ago looking at the effects of 3 hours of running at 9 a.m. versus 3 hours of running at 9 p.m.
Yeah.
And in both conditions, the runners were given the same amount of food. And unsurprisingly, they had worse digestive symptoms when they were consuming it at night. And that seemed to relate to the fact that at night there were greater changes in the stress hormone cortisol, which is involved in that reduction in motility. So that, as another aside, means that if you're training your gut and you're trying to prepare specifically for the event, then it might make sense to do some nighttime gut training too, if you're running through the night. Again, specificity is king, and you always want to make the whole process as specific as possible. So there's that reduction in motility, and then there is also a change in blood flow. And what happens during exercise is that blood flow is redistributed to skeletal muscles to support their function. And for that reason, it gets directed away from splanchnic regions, so from the gut and so on. And that reduction in blood flow, also called ischemia, will actually temporarily compromise the integrity of certain parts of the digestive tract. So if you look at the small intestine, for instance, then it has what are known as epithelia. So these cells that line the small intestine, and the integrity of these is compromised during that ischemia. And what that means is that food within the gut is more likely to pass through those epithelia into the bloodstream. And various different bacteria can get into the bloodstream. I mentioned earlier that if your gut microbiota isn't as diverse and healthy as you would like it to be, then you're more likely to end up with things like E. coli, lipopolysaccharide ending up in the blood, which are not good things. And the problem with this is that as those things enter the blood, there's an immune response that's initiated. Not only that, but the actual damage to the epithelia themselves will also trigger a cascade of changes in the immune system that lead to inflammation. And that inflammation can then actually exacerbate the problem in the first place and further compromise the integrity of the gut. So you've got this vicious cycle that's formed.
Wow.
There are antidotes to that. So your body will produce antibodies against things like lipopolysaccharide, and there will be a subsequent anti-inflammatory response. But if you look at an ultra marathon, then I think for the most part, people's gut symptoms get worse over the course of the events. So it's likely that those issues are never resolved. So that change in blood flow is critical. But then there's also the malabsorption that I mentioned. So some of those carbohydrates entering the colon undigested, and then the water coming into that area, the fermentation of those carbohydrates and so on. And you can also have protein malabsorption too, which causes some similar issues. So there's that as well. And all those different things can manifest as different symptoms. And I'll add one more thought, which is that in rare instances, people will have extreme pain, which might be severe enough for them to end up in hospital or something. And what can happen is that as undigested food enters the colon, there's this, well, as it enters the ileum, so the final part of the small intestine, if it's undigested, then there's the so-called ileal break. And what happens is there's this feedback mechanism. So that's sensed in the ileum, and then that information is relayed such that the motility, so the actual passing of the different breakdown products of the food that you've consumed, is slowed down. So the parts of the digestive system that come before it all of a sudden work less effectively too.
Slow down the conveyor belt, lads. Something bad's come through here.
There's a block in the system.
Yeah.
And in extreme cases, you can have things like gastritis and some other nasty issues. So that could be what's going on there. So there are all of those issues. And just as an aside, if you're experiencing danger pants, and let's say that it comes in the form of diarrhea, there's a good chance that that is reflective of malabsorption and you trying to consume food at a rate that's higher than what your digestive system can process. So that's a little bit more information about that. And
that's good to know, because I can quite understand the feeling, the pressure in the back of your head as an ultra runner that I've got to keep fueling, I've got to keep pushing, like I've got to get more in. And yeah, if your body isn't prepared for that, you could very quickly tie yourself in a knot.
Yeah, absolutely. And we mentioned, I think, in the last episode on nutrition that there is a workaround in the short term, which is that you could use a carbohydrate mouth rinse.
Yes.
Doesn't involve you actually swallowing any food. You're simply rinsing carbohydrate containing solution around your mouth and then spitting it out. And then the information about the availability of the carbohydrates relates to the brain, and then that can positively affect your performance. So that is a short-term band-aid that you could rely on in those instances.
That's good to hear, because I mean, as you touched on there, it is so often the case, and I've seen it myself, that if someone's a couple of days into, say, a 5-day event, and they've already started suffering stomach problems, it's very difficult for them to make their way back from that. They might be able to, get it under control and stay in the event, but it's often unlikely that they're going to be able to recover to a point where they can perform at the level they wanted to when they went into the event. So it's good to know that there is something that can be done to sort of help keep you in the event if you have got into that kind of tangle.
Yeah, and we also mentioned last time there is that medication on Dansitron.
Yeah.
Dansitron that you could use if you're experiencing nausea. I don't recall if I said this, but a lot of people use NSAIDs, ibuprofen, etc., and they are ruinous for the gastrointestinal system, and they affect many different aspects of it, including the integrity of parts of it, certain secretions that are produced. So if you can avoid using those, then that can be a game changer for some people, and there are some alternatives that can be helpful too. So I think practicing your plan in advance, coming up with a strategy that works for you, not trying to force feed yourself, consuming appropriate items, doing away with potential irritants. Those are some of the low-hanging fruit, digesting food better during the event. Another aspect of this is hydration. And I think hydration is something that some people have probably overthought, and there used to be real concern about people undergoing dehydration and ending up in a so-called hypohydrated state, and then that having negative effects on performance and health. And to compensate for that, a lot of people then started over drinking, which can, at its worst, be life-threatening. And there's this condition named hyponatremia that can happen, in which people drink too much water, and as a result of that, the concentration of sodium in the blood becomes so low that certain functions become compromised, and there have been instances of people dying from that. So obviously you don't want to force drink either. And I think a lot of people thought, for whatever reason, that thirst only kicks in once it's too late or once you're past some optimal point, but actually thirst mechanisms are quite sensitive to changes in blood concentration. And ultra running is typically not done at such a high intensity that those concentrations are going to change that quickly. So for ultra runners who are trotting along as opposed to trying to run a sub 2-hour marathon, I don't think that they need to overcomplicate things, and instead just going by thirst and adding plenty of salt to foods, consuming salty items and so on is likely fine for most people. I think that's likely to be more than enough. And the salt is important for a few reasons. So one is just that when you add sodium and other solutes, including carbohydrate and protein, to fluids, you improve your body's ability to hold on to the fluid that you've consumed. Susan Sharefs and Ron Morn did some nice work on this years ago, in which they showed that to replace all of the fluids lost during exercise, it would take about 150% of the fluids lost if someone was consuming pure water. So if they lost 2 liters of water during exercise, they'd have to drink 3 liters of pure water. However, if they added sodium, then the body becomes better at holding on to the water that was consumed. So it's important for that reason, but also it's important for the palatability of water. And that is key as well. But you don't want to overdo it, in part because if you do overdo your drinking, then that, of course, is more fluid volume in your stomach and so on. And that is going to increase the likelihood of you experiencing some of those problems. So I think drinking to thirst works really well for a lot of people. There's also no need to fluid load before the event or anything like that. I think some people have probably historically tried that in instances such as running in extreme heat. And a better approach is just to undergo a period of heat acclimation. So acclimatization is just the adaptations that take place in your body across the seasons naturally without you thinking about it. Whereas acclimation is that active process of you spending some time before an event trying to get ready by mimicking the environmental conditions in which the event is going to take place. And if you look at the research on heat acclimation, it probably takes something like 2 weeks for people to become acclimated to higher temperatures. And that doesn't mean that somebody needs to go and live in the area that the event is taking place necessarily. If somebody takes their bout of exercise during exposure to heat, or if they stick some sauna therapy on the end of a bout of exercise, so they're prolonging the period of time in which their core body temperature remains high, and then the rest of the day they're just going about their business in their normal environments, that works too. You don't need to live in the place.
Hi everyone, sorry to interrupt. Just here to remind you that this episode was brought to you by Resilient Nutrition, and you can find their full range of elite long-range fuels exclusively on the BTU store now. The elite long-range fuels are a series of delicious nut butter products with micronutrients and supplements designed to give you exactly what you need when you need it. They're delicious, they're great for fueling your whatever your adventure is, and you can find them on the BTU store and nowhere else right now. Store.beyondtheultimate.co.uk. That's store.beyondtheultimate.co.uk. Okay, let's get back to the podcast. I can already sense the people listening to this, anyone who's signed up for one of our desert races, their ears have just pricked up here. Because I've seen it, people seem to have these problems to a greater extent when we're out in the desert in the heat. Would that be fair to say, or have I just that's certainly how it appears to me anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. So both high temperatures and dehydration per se can exacerbate gastrointestinal problems. And if there's this period of heat acclimation, then circling back to what I was mentioning before, there are some changes that can help reduce those. And I was speaking about hydration and those approaches to trying to increase hydration status before the event. In the case of heat acclimation, you see an increase in plasma volume of 1 to 2 liters before the event. So your body is naturally increasing your hydration status to compensate for those higher temperatures anyway, as well as undergoing a variety of other adaptations, reduced resting heart rate, change in blood flow, increase in size of sweat glands, earlier, faster sweating, and so on. So if you just undergo an appropriate period of heat acclimation, you'll be fine. And you need at least 2 weeks to maximize those effects. And if you're doing it at home, then you just want to increase the environmental temperature and or use a sauna on the back of exercise. If you can't increase the air temperature, then I suppose there's a rationale for doing things like wearing lots of layers during the exercise. That will raise your core body temperature. One of the more brutal things that I did during my master's degree was participating in a study that looked at thermoregulation during exercise, and it involved doing a VO2 max test while wearing some clothing that removed your sensation of sweating and increased heat storage. And it was absolutely brutal.
That sounds it. Oh, grim. Well, yeah. Thank you for going through that for research purposes.
I say it was brutal, and I realize now how soft I am, because most people listening to this will have done things that are approximately 400 times more brutal than that. So forgive me for being so soft. So heat acclimation by itself will give you a lot of the adaptations that you need. And then otherwise just relying on drinking to thirst and having some sodium handy if you really need it, but just consuming salty foods, that should do the trick for the most part for most people.
I mean, excellent. Is there any particular reason why? I know we've sort of talked in there about the temperature and you can become acclimated to it within a couple of weeks, but I've just seen so many more stomach problems out there in the desert. Is it, I guess there's other factors in there as well in the environment, that just the higher temperatures mean what, you're more likely to encounter spoiled foods, you're more likely to come across, it's more likely that stuff that you haven't sealed properly in your bag is going to end up with more bacteria and stuff in it. That
makes complete sense. And of course there are other things like traveler's diarrhea. The whole process of getting somewhere complicates things. Whenever you hop on a plane and end up on the other side of the planet, you're going to expose yourself to all sorts of different pathogens that your body's not used to, all of which are going to pose threats to your immune system. So it's the combination of the exercise, which will increase your propensity to picking up infections, and all of the new microorganisms that you're being exposed to, and then probably some other things in the environment too. So I don't know, if you're running through the desert and you're constantly having sand kicked up in your face, then your body has to deal with all of that too. So there are all these different factors at play that presumably could contribute. And just one other thought that might be helpful, might not always be practical, but might be helpful, is that drinking cool fluids can help as well. So there's some evidence that when people drink fluids of maybe 0 to 7 degrees Celsius, they can both reduce the degree to which their core body temperature increases during exercise, which is a good thing because ultimately the temperature of your brain can be limiting to your performance. But also drinking cool fluids might help maintain the integrity of the gut lining. So it's probably good for multiple reasons to pick a cool fluid when possible, hence the rationale for people using things like slurry drinks and so on, or otherwise having some cooling garments that could reduce the temperature of the brain or the neck region.
Something I've seen a couple of runners do, really, or a few runners do on the run-up to events, is taking extra probiotics before in the couple of weeks before they know they're going to be traveling somewhere, in the hope of, I don't know, staving off some of these problems they might get from traveler's diarrhea. I've also heard people taking charcoal tablets and stuff like that on the run-in in the hope of controlling any toxins they might accidentally get through their food because they're traveling. Is there anything to be said for any of that?
Probiotics are interesting because it certainly seems that when people take appropriate strains and appropriate doses of certain probiotics, they can positively affect some aspects of immune function, and they can be helpful for certain conditions, including some gastrointestinal disorders. So there's that side of it. But then at the same time, looking at the function of the gut during prolonged exhaustive exercise, there's also actually been some evidence that I found counterintuitive, but not entirely, because it always depends on the strain and so on, that consuming some probiotics could actually exacerbate some of those negative effects that I mentioned earlier in terms of changes in the epithelial integrity in the gut and subsequent inflammatory responses, so certain cytokines and so on. So I don't know that taking probiotics is something that I would necessarily recommend, because you might be positively affecting some things and negatively affecting others.
Right.
But I think that it's also possible that at some point, as we get better at being able to give people personalized recommendations about specific probiotic strains to take, they will come into their own. I just think that right now, a lot of people take probiotics thinking probiotics are good, and they aren't necessarily good. It depends very much on the signatures of their own microorganisms, recognizing that, going by recent figures, we probably are something like 10 times more microorganism than we are human in terms of the numbers of cells in our bodies. So
there's a harrowing thought to leave everyone with.
Yeah.
Most of you isn't you.
No, it's not. It's not. You're a walking, talking ecosystem, which is quite weird when you think about it. Kind of cool, but kind of scary. So not sure that I recommend any, certainly no specific ones generally. Activated charcoal is interesting. It's very popular in certain circles. I'm not very familiar with the literature, but I believe that it does have its place in detoxifying certain pathogens or toxic agents in some instances. And I can think of friends who I know who are quite switched on, who will take activated charcoal after things like a heavy night of drinking. But I'm not close enough to that literature to recommend it in this context. And I'm also not sure that there's been work looking at the effects of activated charcoal consumption in running, let alone ultra endurance running. So I'm not sure that I would push for those, and I'd instead just reiterate some of the basic principles of hygiene while people are away.
Yeah.
And then also recognize that your nutrition and your training loads and your sleep are really strong determinants of your immune function in general. So we spoke a bit in the first podcast that we recorded about the effects of sleep on immune function. And your general patterns of nutrition are important. So you want to have that diverse array of different plants in your diet. But then training stress is key as well. And this is also very relevant to the integrity of the gut in general, because if somebody is undergoing very large training volumes, so let's say that somebody was purposely trying to overreach, they're trying to temporarily push the envelope and then go through a period of recovery afterwards and bounce back stronger. It's during those times when the immune system might become compromised. And it's also at those times when the integrity of the gastrointestinal system can be especially compromised. So I think having an appropriate training taper is really important too. And you really want to turn up at the start line being as well rested as possible in terms of your sleep and your training and having your energy stores full. And then if you look at the effects of different things on immune responses to exercise, then carbohydrate and protein are really important. So putting aside the probiotics and vitamins and different purportedly immune enhancing compounds, bovine colostrum, glutamine, and some others, I think just getting a carbohydrate and protein intake right is a really important start. We haven't mentioned the very low carbohydrate ketogenic enthusiasts, and there probably are some listening to this. It hasn't been very well studied, so it's really hard to give recommendations to those people about how to best go about their nutrition. So I'll just say, and I probably said this last time, that type of approach, at least in my mind, seems most likely to be helpful for people when events are longer and intensities are lower, and when the event is self-supported too, because obviously fat contains more calories per gram than carbohydrates or protein. And if you're carrying around fewer grams of food over a very long time, then that's going to be a good thing in many ways. It's going to reduce the amount that you sweat. It's going to positively affect some aspects of your running economy if we put metabolism aside. When I say metabolism, I mean nutrient metabolism and substrate availability and so on. So I'll just add that, but it's probably a bit of a digression to go into a long discussion about that.
No, it sounds like it. I suppose as well that it's worth saying, I remember when I did the Ice Ultra, which was a few years ago now, I realized that I was going to need more calories for being in that environment. So I was going to be very, very cold for quite a long while. So I'd made a point of including in my food, in my snacks, quite a lot of nuts, pepper army style things, sort of food that I knew was going to have high fat content, and therefore I was going to be able to get more calories out of. I then made sure that I was eating those during my training runs in the month or so leading up to the event, so that my body was prepared for that.
Perfect. And obviously I'm involved in the company Resilient Nutrition. Our first product is a nut butter based product, and that's designed for self-supported ultra endurance athletes. The first prototypes of that we made were for people rowing the Atlantic, and you're at sea for several weeks on end and you've got to carry all of your food. So in that instance, that type of product is perfect. And nut butters are preferable to nuts, in my opinion, for a few reasons. One is that they're mechanically pre-digested.
Yeah.
Another is that more of the calories in the nuts are available to you when they're ground into a paste or a butter, because if you consume whole nuts, then a lot of the fat in the nuts remains bound to cell walls and you just end up excreting it. Whereas if you grind it, then the number of available calories, metabolizable calories, is about 50% higher. So if you consume 1,000 calories worth of almonds from whole almonds, you would probably be able to actually take up roughly half of those calories. In a nut butter, you could take up about all of those calories.
Wow, I had no idea. I didn't think for a second the proportion would be that big. Literally half of the almonds wasted time.
So the particular study that I'm thinking of found a 48% difference in the number of metabolizable calories.
Wow, that's incredible.
Huge difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I never would have guessed that at all. Once again, Greg, I'm glad you're here.
but I think when we're talking about nutrition, I mentioned earlier that during exercise, you can probably only take on board carbohydrate at a certain rate. And you can burn calories very quickly during exercise. So by the end of the day, you're going to be in a quite substantial negative energy balance. Potentially, you've burned a lot more calories than you've consumed. And so the post-exercise period becomes really important, especially during a multi-stage ultra.
Well, that's the last item gone off my notes, Greg. I didn't need to be here at all. Crack on.
And I think something that's worth bearing in mind is that there's going to be a period of time following the race when your digestive system remains compromised. So you shouldn't finish your race and then try and stuff in all of the calories that you've burned through that you haven't compensated for. And instead, a better strategy seems to be to have something like 0.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight and 1.2 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight at that post-exercise meal. So that could be as you're slowing down at the end of the day, or it could be just after you've stopped, or it could be shortly thereafter. In training, I'd actually wait a little bit until the gut becomes a little bit more like its former self after the exercise before consuming something. But on these days, you're trying to consume so much food that I would probably do it while I was slowing down from the exercise or right at the end of the exercise. And then each hour or so after that, you want to repeat similar feedings. But then right at the end of the day, if you're really short on energy, then I think that's probably a prime time to consume quite a lot of a fat-rich item too. And that way you can start to compensate for some of those changes in energy balance that are taking place. It all depends on things like the structure of the event, whether it's a 24-hour race or whether it's a multi-day race in which each day has discrete distances that are being run and so on. But that post-exercise period is really important. And we also touched on some supplements that you can take in the last podcast that we did. So people can refer back to that for more information about some of the supplements they can take to speed the recovery process. So I think that's key. And then you don't want to force drink at that time either. It's possible for people to drink so quickly that they end up with clear urine, which might make them think that they're well hydrated, but they're actually still very hypohydrated, still very short on water. And so you want to sip water over extended periods instead in the couple of hours post-exercise rather than guzzling it all at once. And I'll mention just a general tip about hydration. There are probably three things that you should pay attention to, especially over the course of multi-stage races. So one is your body weight each day. And within 1 day of running, if you stay in water balance, so if you stay euhydrated, so in an appropriate state of hydration, then you should expect to lose probably at least 2 kilograms based on research by Martin Hoffman over the course of 1 day of ultra running. The reason is that during ultra running, you'll burn through your muscle glycogen stores. And as you do that, each gram of carbohydrate in glycogen associates with probably 1 to 3 grams of water. The number's not exactly clear. So if you lose that glycogen, you're losing water from your muscles. And for that reason, you're going to be lighter at the end, even if you stay well hydrated. But then as you top up your glycogen stores after the race, your body weight's going to come back. So just bear that in mind. Next, from one day to the next, so one morning to the next, you probably don't want your body weight to shift by more than about 1 kilogram if possible. I think that's a reasonable target. So you don't want to lose more than 1 kilogram per day. And if you stick to the strategies that we've discussed, and I think that should be doable, then obviously there is thirst, and I think drinking to thirst is fine for the most part. And then there's the color of the urine as well. Urine color can be quite misleading. During exercise, there are various changes. There's redistribution of blood flow, and there are changes in blood flow to the kidneys, change in certain hormones that are involved in the retention of fluid and so on. And all of that leads to urine concentration. So if you stay in a well-hydrated state during exercise, your urine will get darker anyway by itself. And the most telling urine sample that you pass each day is the one at the start of each morning. Because what's happened is overnight, fluid in different compartments in your body have equilibrated such that in the morning, the urine in your bladder is representative of your general hydration status. So when you wake up in the morning, your goal should be to pass a urine sample which is no darker than the color of apple juice. I think that the apple juice rule works quite well for most people.
I've heard it's apple juice. I've heard it's straw.
Okay, straw if that's your preference. So I think that's a pretty simple tip that
it's not unusual on an ultra marathon at all. For the first thing a medic says to you when you see them is, "What color is your pee?" And I've got quite used to that.
Before they even say hi.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Greg, we've kind of hit the hour mark again. This is I love listening to you go. And I feel like we've really quite successfully covered there, sort of a couple of weeks out, right the way through to after you've crossed the finish line with nutrition as well. It's felt like a really good little package we've put together here. I don't want to cut you off early if you've got more you want to go into.
No, I was just thinking about the fact that there are probably one or two things that we haven't covered that I can just quickly add.
Go on.
But I am unusually long-winded, I know that. So one of them
I'd say thorough, Greg.
One of them is just that your nutrition needs do change with certain exposures. And I'm thinking of this, Will, because you mentioned that you did an ice ultra.
Of course,
and you would know that you'd be burning more calories during that. So during cold exposure, your body will produce more of its own heat in order to compensate for the cold exposure. And exercise during cold exposure has not been well studied at all. It's been much less studied than exercise during heat exposure, for example. But I think there are good reasons to think that your energy expenditure is going to increase during those types of events. So you need to compensate for that. And then you also need to consider certain practicalities too, like the patency of the foods and drinks that you consume during very low temperatures. So just consider those aspects of the nutrition. And then in terms of the physiological changes, there are things like changes in blood flow because you get vasoconstriction or the constriction of blood vessels in the periphery, you get lower muscle temperature, you get lower cardiac output, all of which can impair performance. So staying warm is really important, unsurprisingly. But one common issue is altitude. So if you're doing an ultra at altitude, then there are certain things that you should account for. So one is that the higher that you go, the more calories you'll burn at rest. So the more your basal metabolic rate will increase, but the higher your exercise energy expenditure will become as well. Just to give you an example, at 2,000 meters or so, somebody will at rest burn something like 300 calories more each day.
Right, okay.
The higher you get, the more problematic that can become, because it's not necessary the appetite moves in lockstep with that. And you'll burn through carbohydrate more quickly. Your body will be less good at synthesizing new muscle proteins. And because of those changes, I think carbohydrate and protein needs increase, probably more so than fat, but you just need to be cognizant of the fact that you're burning so much energy You need to make sure that you eat enough food. So there's that. But then there is changes in the humidity of the air, and obviously there's the hypoxia as well, both of which can contribute to dehydration. So being careful about your fluid intake is probably especially important at altitude as well. Then there is the fact that your body's ability to form new red blood cells during exposure to altitude can be compromised. And so your iron needs might well go up at altitude. They almost certainly will, and they probably will in accordance with how high you go. So you should work with your healthcare practitioner to decide on appropriate iron supplementation if necessary. But often that means between 1 and 200 milligrams of elemental iron per day. So consider that as well. And just as an aside, I know that we mentioned iron in the last podcast, but exercise can actually impair your body's ability to take up that iron because of the production of certain things like hepcidin. And so if possible, you want to take the iron supplement away from the bout of exercise. So a few hours away from it. Again, that's if practical. I'm just mentioning that. And then also, obviously, vitamin C can improve the uptake of it, but tannins, which you find in things like tea, can impair the uptake. And there are some other factors too, like calcium can worsen iron uptake. So iron is really important. And then there's also an increase in oxidative stress at altitude. People will have heard of antioxidants. That doesn't mean that you should supplement with antioxidants like vitamin C and vitamin E or anything like that necessarily. But I think there are good reasons to think that some antioxidant supporting supplements could be helpful, foremost among which, in my mind at least, is N-acetylcysteine, NAC. And that gets broken down in your body into cysteine. Cysteine serves as a precursor to a master antioxidant named glutathione. And by supporting that system, you'll be able to better quench some of the oxidative stress that you experience at altitude. And I don't hesitate recommending that because I don't think that it's likely to lead to some of the problems that high doses of vitamin antioxidants like C and E can cause. So I'd probably consider that as well. But I think those are some of the key considerations at altitude. So I think that covers the different environments that people might experience and hopefully just helps a couple more people.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'm really glad you did that because I literally threw my notes across the room about 10 minutes ago to flamboyantly make a point, and I'd completely forgotten we were going to talk about that before the end of this podcast. So yeah, cheers once again, Greg. I'm glad you're here. I'm going to have to give you the red glasses after this, and you can host the podcast instead. But no, seriously, thanks very much. I have no doubt at all that the people who've been listening to the 3 episodes we've done with you over the course of the last month or so now have been, that they've been really enjoyed and they've been really, really interesting and just are going to arm people with tons of useful information for whatever adventures it is that they're going to branch out into once we all finally get out of this lockdown cycle that we're in. So thanks very much, Greg. It's greatly appreciated.
Pleasure. Thank you, Will.
No worries. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.